I'll do it. I'll marry him. But don't you dare call it love, and don't you dare call it a choice because we both know what it is. Eleanor Wade said those words at 19 years old, standing at the edge of the only life she had ever known. Wearing a dress that belonged to someone else, holding flowers she hadn't picked about to walk toward a man she had spoken 40 words to in her entire life. Her father's debt was real. The bank's deadline was real. Clayton Hartwell's offer was real. Everything else, the wedding, the vows, the ring, was a transaction dressed in white, and every single person in that church knew it. If this is your first time here, please subscribe to our channel and follow this story all the way to the end. And drop a comment letting us know what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far this story travels. The dress didn't fit. That was the first thing Eleanor Wade noticed when her mother fastened the last button at the back of her neck. The fabric pulled wrong across her shoulders, the hem dragging half an inch too long across the floorboards, the waist cinched in a place that wasn't her waist at all. It had belonged to her Aunt Vera, married off young in a different county during a different hard season. Now it belonged to Eleanor, and it fit her the way borrowed trouble always fits close enough to wear wrong enough to feel every second. "Hold still," her mother said, and her voice had that particular flatness that meant she was not going to cry, had already decided she was not going to cry, and was holding the decision with both hands so it wouldn't slip. "Mama." "Hold still, Eleanor." She held still. Through the single window of the back room at First Methodist, she could hear the town settling into the pews. She could hear boots on the wooden floor, the creak of the old bench near the door that had been creaking since before she was born, the low murmur of voices that people think are quiet, but never really are. She had grown up in Callow Creek. She knew every voice in that building. She knew exactly what they were saying without hearing a single word clearly. Her father was already waiting at the front. Thomas Wade, 52 years old, with the hands of a man who had worked land his whole life and the posture of a man who had recently stopped believing that work would be enough. He'd been different since the bank notice came. Quieter, slower. Like something inside him had folded up and gone somewhere she couldn't reach. Eleanor loved her father. She had always loved him the way you love something that has cost you something deeply, with a kind of ache underneath it that you couldn't explain to someone who hadn't lived it. He had taught her to ride before she could read. He had named the constellations for her lying on their backs in the summer grass when she was 6 years old. He had held her hand at her grandmother's funeral and not said a single word, and somehow that had been exactly right. He had also 3 weeks ago shaken hands with Clayton Hartwell and agreed to give his daughter over in exchange for the clearing of a debt that had been swallowing the family whole for 2 years. She had not been in the room when it happened. She had found out at supper when her father set down his fork and looked at the center of the table instead of at her and said quietly, "It's arranged." Her younger brother Holt had asked, "What's arranged?" and her mother had told him to go check on the horses even though the horses were fine. And then her father had explained it in the careful, measured tone of a man who has rehearsed what he is going to say, but not how he is going to feel while he is saying it. The bank was calling in the note. The land would go. The house would go. Everything Thomas Wade's father had broken his back to build in this valley gone before the first frost. Clayton Hartwell had approached him at the feed store, had said he understood the situation, had said he was a fair man and a practical one, and that he was looking to remarry, and that he had a proposition if Thomas was willing to listen. Thomas had listened. "You didn't ask me," Eleanor said when her father finished. "No," her father said. "I didn't." The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard in that kitchen. "She's 19, Thomas," her mother said softly. Not an argument exactly, more like a fact laid out on the table for everyone to look at. "I know how old she is." Her father picked up his fork again. He didn't eat. "It's done." Eleanor had sat at that table for a long time after everyone else got up. She sat and looked at the grain of the wood and felt something moving through her that she didn't have a name for. It wasn't only anger, though. There was anger in it. It wasn't only fear, though. There was plenty of that. It was something bigger than both. It was the feeling of a door closing on a room you hadn't finished living in yet, She had cried that night. Once. Into her pillow quietly, the way she had learned to cry when she was small and didn't want her parents to hear. Then she had gotten up in the morning and started deciding how to survive it. Gay. Clayton Hartwell arrived at the church in a dark jacket and clean-pressed trousers, and the first thing Eleanor noticed about him, before she noticed his face, before she noticed the size of him, before she noticed anything else, was that he waited. He stood at the altar, and he waited. He did not pace. He did not check his watch. He did not look toward the back of the church with any particular expression of impatience or anticipation. He simply stood and waited, the way a man waits who has learned somewhere along the way that things arrive in their own time and that rushing them changes nothing. She had seen him before, of course. Callow Creek was not a large town. She had seen him at the general store, at the livestock auction once, at the church social 3 years ago, where he had spoken to the pastor for a long time and not danced once. She knew he was 41. She knew he ran the largest cattle operation in the county. She knew he had been married before and that his wife had died. She did not know much else. She walked down the aisle on her father's arm, and she kept her eyes forward and her back straight because she had decided that morning that whatever else happened, she was not going to walk down this aisle looking like a girl being dragged somewhere against her will, even if that was precisely what was happening. She was going to walk like a woman making a choice, even if the choice had been made for her, because that was the only kind of dignity left available to her, and she intended to take it. The whispers in the pews were a physical thing. She felt them on her skin. She heard Margaret Pruitt. She knew it was Margaret Pruitt by the particular pitch of that woman's concern-shaped cruelty. Murmur something to the woman beside her. She heard the words, "poor thing," and "that dress," and "what on earth was Thomas thinking?" And she felt her jaw tighten and her chin lift a fraction of an inch. She heard someone on the other side say, "Hartwell always gets what he wants," and she stored that away somewhere dark and quiet inside herself to examine later. She reached the altar. Clayton Hartwell turned to look at her then, and for the first time she looked back at him directly. He was taller than she remembered. His face was weathered in the way of men who spend their lives outdoors, not rough, not unkind, but marked. There were lines around his eyes and a steadiness in his expression that she couldn't immediately classify as either coldness or calm. He looked at her the way you look at something you're trying to understand, not the way you look at something you already own. She didn't know yet whether that distinction mattered. Pastor Gibbs cleared his throat and opened his Bible, and the service began. Eleanor said her vows in a clear voice. She had practiced them that morning in front of the small mirror in her room, speaking quietly, so no one would hear. Not because she wanted to be ready for them, but because she had been afraid that when the moment came, the words would stick somewhere in her throat, and she had decided that was not going to happen either. She was not going to stumble. She was not going to hesitate where the whole town could see. She said every word clearly, every syllable precise and deliberate. Clayton said his in a voice low enough that she almost didn't hear them, which surprised her. She had expected something declarative from a man of his position. Instead, the words came out quietly directed at her, and not at the room, and she caught herself filing that detail away before she'd decided what to do with it. When it was done, the ring was on her finger, a plain gold band. Nothing elaborate, and she appreciated that, for reasons she couldn't fully have explained, and Pastor Gibbs pronounced them husband and wife, and the church exhaled around them like a held breath released. Clayton did not kiss her at the altar. He turned to her, looked at her face for a moment, and then he offered her his arm instead. Behind them the applause was polite and sparse, and entirely appropriate for a wedding that everyone present knew had not been planned for love. Eleanor took his arm. She walked back down that aisle on the arm of a man she had spoken 40 words to in her entire life, in a dress that had belonged to someone else, carrying a small bunch of late-season wildflowers that her mother had pressed into her hands that morning because there had not been money for anything else, and she held her head up the entire length of the aisle. She held it up the whole way. The reception, such as it was, happened in the churchyard. Someone had set out a table with cake and lemonade, and the women of the congregation stood in their clusters and the men stood in theirs, and Eleanor moved through it all feeling like she was watching herself from a slight distance. Like part of her had retreated to somewhere inside herself and was observing the whole proceedings with a kind of careful, quiet wariness. Her father found her near the table. He put his hand on her arm, and she felt how much he was carrying in that touch. The apology. He hadn't said the explanation. He couldn't give the hope she was almost certain he held that she would be all right. That this would be all right. "Eleanor," he started. "Don't," she said. Not angrily. She was too tired for anger by then, and anyway, she was not going to do this in the churchyard with half the town watching. "Not today, Daddy." He nodded. His hand tightened briefly on her arm, and then he let go. She turned back to the yard and found Clayton Hartwell standing about 10 feet away, talking to Joe Aldridge from the neighboring property, or rather, listening to Joe Aldridge, who was talking at some length about something Eleanor couldn't hear. Clayton was nodding at appropriate intervals in the way of a man who is being courteous without being particularly engaged. As if he felt her looking, he glanced over. Their eyes met. He said something brief to Joe, who laughed and clapped him on the shoulder, and then Clayton walked toward her with that same unhurried deliberateness she'd noted at the altar. "Are you ready to go?" he said. No pleasantries, no performance, just a direct question asked in a reasonable voice. "Yes," she said. They left the churchyard side by side, and she heard the hum of conversation start up behind them before they'd reached the gate, and she understood with absolute clarity that the talk would go on for weeks, would probably go on for months. That the story of Eleanor Wade and Clayton Hartwell's arrangement marriage would travel through every kitchen and parlor and Sunday gathering in Callow Creek like a river finding its own level. She let it go. She didn't have the energy to carry it, and she was going to need every bit of what she had for what came next. The Hartwell Ranch was 7 miles outside of town, and they traveled in the wagon mostly in silence. It was not a hostile silence. Eleanor had braced herself for something, for a speech for expectations, laid out plainly, for something that would make the territory clearer and also worse. What she got instead was a man who appeared entirely comfortable with quiet watching the road ahead of him and letting the miles pass without filling them. After about 4 miles, he said, "There are some things you should know before we get there." "All right," she said. "Mrs. Pruitt. That's the housekeeper. She's been with the ranch 12 years. She'll show you where things are. You don't answer to her, but she knows the place well, and there's no reason not to use that." He paused. "You'll have your own room, your own space. I won't come into it without an invitation." She had been staring at the road ahead of them. She turned slightly to look at his profile. He kept his eyes on the horses. "I'm not." He stopped, seemed to select the next words deliberately. "I know what this looks like. I know what people are saying. I want to be plain with you, so there's no confusion about what this arrangement is." "Then be plain," she said. "I needed a wife," he said without embarrassment, as though it were a perfectly ordinary statement, and maybe she thought in the world he operated in it was. "The ranch needs managing that I can't do alone. The hands respect the position of a household, and I—" Another pause. "I've been alone a long time. I wasn't looking for a transaction. I was looking for a partnership." Eleanor absorbed this. "A partnership," she said. "Between a man who has everything and a girl with nothing. Between a man who has land and resources and no family," he said, "and a woman who has capability and good sense and no security. Those aren't nothing." She looked at him for a long moment. He still didn't look at her. Still watched the road, and she realized, she respected, that the way he wasn't trying to perform the conversation, wasn't trying to make it into something it wasn't. "I have conditions," she said. Something changed almost imperceptibly in his posture. Not defensiveness. Something closer to attention. "Go ahead." "I want to write to my family without asking permission. I want to visit them on my own terms." "Done." "I want to know what's happening with the finances of this ranch, not to interfere, to understand." A brief silence. "Done." "And if this doesn't work—" She stopped, felt the weight of what she was about to say. "If this becomes something I cannot live in, I want to know there's a path forward that doesn't leave me worse than I came to you." He was quiet for a moment longer than the previous answers. "I won't trap you," he said finally. "That's not what I'm building." She turned back to the road. She didn't know yet whether she believed him, but she had said what she needed to say, and he had answered without flinching, and that was more than she had expected from this day. The ranch came into view around the last turn, wide and settled, and established in a way that her family's land had never quite managed to be. And Eleanor Wade now, Eleanor Hartwell looked at it and breathed in and out once slowly. She had survived the day. That would have to be enough for now. The first week was an exercise in learning where the edges were. Not the edges of Clayton's patience. She had not yet found those, and she was honestly uncertain whether they existed in the way she'd feared, but the edges of the life she had stepped into. The ranch ran on a rhythm as fixed and unforgiving as a clock, and every person on it knew their part in that rhythm. And she was the single element that didn't yet. Mrs. Pruitt was 60, stout, brisk, and entirely without sentimentality. She showed Eleanor the kitchen and the larder and the supply room and the linen cabinet with the efficient thoroughness of a woman who had shown people around this house many times and intended to show them around many more. And she answered every question Eleanor asked with complete accuracy and not a single additional word. At the end of the first day's tour, Mrs. Pruitt had looked at her steadily and said, "I don't involve myself in personal matters, Mrs. Hartwell. That's not what I'm here for. But I'll tell you what I told Mr. Hartwell when he hired me. This kitchen runs the ranch as sure as the cattle do, and I run the kitchen, and as long as we're clear on that, we'll get along fine." "We're clear," Eleanor said. Mrs. Pruitt had nodded once, turned, and gone back to the stove. It was, Eleanor thought, just about the most honest welcome she was going to get, and she was grateful for it. The ranch hands were 6 in number, and they treated her the way men who work land treat most things they're uncertain about, with watchful distance and careful courtesy. She learned their names in the first 3 days. Walt Denny, the 2 Carver brothers. She privately called them Big Carver and Less Big Carver until she sorted out which one was Amos and which was Saul, a young hand named Pip, who couldn't have been more than 17 and clearly wished he were somewhere else, and a quieter older man called Reuben, who appeared to speak only when absolutely necessary and to see significantly more than he ever commented on. She did not try to befriend them all at once. She did her work, the bread baking, the mending, the 100 small domestic tasks that fell to the household, and she did it without complaint and without asking to be noticed, and she watched. Clayton Hartwell. She was learning, ran his ranch the same way he had spoken to her in the wagon, directly, without theater, and with an economy of words that forced you to pay attention to the ones he chose. She heard him through the kitchen window one morning tell Denny and Walt that the northeast fence line needed restringing before the cattle pushed through it. And the way he said it, quiet, specific, already moving on to the next thing, made both men move without question. Not because they feared him. She understood that quickly, because he had already assessed the situation correctly, and they knew it. She stored this away, too. 12 days in, she found out about his wife. She hadn't asked. She had been careful not to ask. It felt like pressing on a bruise she had no right to touch yet. But the information came to her sideways, the way important things often do, through a gap in a conversation she wasn't supposed to be part of. She had come into the main room to return a book she'd borrowed from the shelf. Clayton had told her to borrow what she liked, and she had taken him at his word and heard his voice through the half-open door of the study, low and even, and another voice she didn't immediately recognize. "Just saying, it's a strange business, Clayton. The girl can't be more than—" "She's 19, Clayton said. "And her name is Eleanor." A pause. "Right. Well, don't you think you should have— after Margaret. A person might think you'd want to—" "What a person might want," Clayton said. And she heard something in his voice she hadn't heard before. A thinness, a restraint, like something held very carefully. "And what a person decides to do are separate things, and I'd appreciate it if we stayed on the business that brought you out here." The other voice shifted. Of course. Right. About the water rights. Eleanor set the book down quietly on the table and went back to the kitchen. Margaret. She sat with the name for the rest of the afternoon, and she thought about the way he had said it, not with tenderness, not with bitterness, but with something that was neither, something that lived in the space between the two and did not move from it. She didn't ask him about it that evening, but something shifted in how she thought about him, not softened exactly, not warmer, but complicated in a way that made her look at him differently over supper, and when he passed her the bread without being asked, and said, "You seem tired." And she said, "I'm fine." And he said, "You don't have to be." She sat with those 5 words for a long time after she'd gone to bed. You don't have to be. She wasn't sure yet what to do with a man who said things like that. She wasn't sure what it meant. But she was beginning to understand that the story she had told herself about this arrangement, the story where she was the trapped one and he was the captor, and the ranch was the cage, was not the only story available, and that the edges of this life were not where she had originally drawn them. She lay in the dark of the room that was hers, in the house that was not yet home, in the life she had not chosen, and she stared at the ceiling and thought about those 5 words. Outside, the wind moved through the grass, and the ranch went on existing around her, solid and indifferent and entirely real. And Eleanor. Wade. Eleanor. Hartwell pulled the blanket up around her shoulders and decided that tomorrow she would stop surviving the days and start paying attention to them. It was, she thought, the bravest decision she had made since she walked down that aisle. And no one would ever know she had made it. She had told herself she would start paying attention. What she hadn't accounted for was how much there was to see once she actually started looking. The bread was the first thing. 3 days after she made that quiet decision in the dark, Eleanor tried her hand at the ranch's weekly baking. 4 loaves, the kind that needed to last through the work week and hold up to being carried out to men in the field. She had baked bread before plenty of times, but the oven at the Hartwell Ranch ran hotter than the one at her family's house, and she didn't know it yet, and the first 2 loaves came out wrong. Not ruined edible solid, but the crust was too hard, and the inside was dense in a way that tasted more like effort than skill. She set them on the table and looked at them, and felt a particular irritation that had nothing to do with the bread, and everything to do with the fact that she was 19 years old and living in a stranger's house, and couldn't even get a loaf right. Mrs. Pruitt came in, looked at the loaves, looked at Eleanor, and said without any detectable sympathy, "That oven runs hot on the left side. Move your pans right and drop the temperature 20 degrees. "I didn't know," Eleanor said. "Now you do," Mrs. Pruitt said, and poured herself a cup of coffee and went back to her business. The next 2 loaves came out right. Clayton said nothing about the bread at supper, but he took 2 pieces instead of 1, and she noticed, and she was more unreasonably satisfied by that than she wanted to admit. That was when she understood something important. There was a whole language operating in this house that had nothing to do with words, and if she was going to live here, really live here, not just endure it, she was going to have to learn to speak it. So she did. She learned the rhythms of the kitchen, the particular way the hinges on the back door needed lifting slightly before pulling, or they'd stick the fact that Reuben drank his coffee black and scalding, and was in the worst mood of his day until he'd had it, and that Pip the young hand had a habit of skipping breakfast and then making mistakes by mid-morning that he wouldn't have made on a full stomach. She started leaving something out on the kitchen table early. Nothing elaborate, just biscuits or cold cornbread, and she never said a word about it, and Pip never said a word about it either, but the mistakes stopped, and once passing her on his way to the barn, he said, "Morning, Mrs. Hartwell," with a warmth that was genuinely meant and that felt like something. It was not a grand life. It was not the life she had imagined. Not that she had imagined. Much had been too busy surviving the present to give the future serious thought, but it was a life with texture to it, with the particular satisfaction of things done correctly, and the particular frustration of things not yet understood. And somewhere in the middle of the 3rd week, she realized with a kind of shock that left her standing still in the middle of the kitchen that she had gone an entire morning without thinking about the wedding. She didn't know what to do with that. She stood there for a moment holding a jar of preserves she'd been about to put away, and she turned the realization over in her mind the way you turn something unfamiliar to find where it fits. And then Mrs. Pruitt walked in and said, "Are you going to stand there all day?" And Eleanor put the preserves away and got on with the afternoon. But she held the thought. Something in the shape of this life was fitting around her in a way she hadn't expected. She wasn't sure yet whether that frightened her or not. Clayton came in from the east pasture one afternoon near the end of the third week with a long cut across the back of his right-hand barbed wire. She could tell by the look of it, narrow and clean and deep enough to matter, and he was already at the pump washing it when she saw him from the window. She brought out the medicine box without being asked. He looked up when she came through the door, registered what she was carrying, and said nothing. He held his hand still while she cleaned the cut, which was worse than it looked from a distance, and she worked without talking, because there was nothing to say, and the work required attention. He watched her hands, not her face. She was almost done when he said, "You're not squeamish." "No," she said. "Most people are. Most people haven't helped calve cattle in the dark and kept everyone calm about it," she said, without looking up, and she felt more than heard the small shift in him, not quite a laugh, but the almost shape of one. "Your father's spread," he said, "since I was 12. She tied off the bandage with a neat knot. "Hold that pressure for a few minutes. It needs to seal." He looked at his hand. Then he said, "I didn't know that about you." "There's a lot you don't know about me," she said, and the words came out evenly without an edge because it was simply true and not an accusation. He looked at her, then really looked at her, the way he hadn't quite done since the wedding, and she met it without looking away, because she had decided she was done being looked at without looking back. "That's fair," he said. She put the medicine box under her arm and went back inside, and she stood in the kitchen for a moment with her heart moving a little faster than the task required, and she thought, there it is. That's the edge I couldn't find before. Not an edge of danger, an edge of something else entirely. She put the box away and started on supper. The first time she heard about Margaret was from the housekeeper, not from Clayton. She had learned enough about Mrs. Pruitt by then to understand that the woman did not trade in gossip. What she offered rarely at unexpected moments was information she had decided you needed delivered plainly and without decoration, and usually when you least anticipated it. It came on a Thursday evening when Eleanor was hemming a shirt, and Mrs. Pruitt was going through the linen inventory at the other end of the table. The house was quiet. The hands had turned in. Clayton was still in the study with the account books. Without preamble, without looking up from her count, Mrs. Pruitt said, "His wife's name was Margaret Calloway when he married her, Margaret Hartwell after. She died in childbirth 4 years ago. The baby, too." Eleanor's needle stopped. "The baby was a son," Mrs. Pruitt continued in the same tone she might have used to report a weather forecast. "He had a name already, William." She set down one pile of linen and picked up another. "I'm not telling you this to upset you, or to set the stage for something. I'm telling you because you've been good enough not to ask, and I've been watching you figure out this house piece by piece, and you deserve to have that piece too." Eleanor looked down at the shirt in her hands. She thought about the way Clayton had gone still when that visitor said Margaret's name. The particular quality of that stillness, not grief, not anger, something older than both. Something that had been lived with long enough to become part of a person's structure. "How long did he close himself off?" she asked. Mrs. Pruitt thought about it. "About a year where you could see it. Longer where you couldn't." "Does it—" Eleanor stopped. "Does it what? Does it affect how he—" She wasn't sure how to finish the sentence. "How he sees me. How he'll always be measuring me against a ghost. How I'll always be living in a house with someone who loved someone else first and lost them in the worst way possible." Mrs. Pruitt set down the linen entirely and looked at her. "He is not a man who transfers pain onto other people," she said. "I've known him 12 years. He keeps it where it lives. He doesn't use it as an excuse, and he doesn't use it as a weapon." She paused. "That's not nothing." "No," Eleanor said slowly. "It's not." She went back to the hemming. but the shirt was blurry for a moment, and she had to blink twice before the stitches came clear again. She was in the garden, the kitchen garden at the side of the house, still half wild, clearly. Something that had been tended once, and then not on a Saturday morning when she heard the wagon coming up the road, and before she could place the sound, she heard a voice she would have recognized anywhere. "Eleanor! Eleanor, is that you?" Her brother Holt standing up in the wagon bed waving both arms like a signal fire. She was through the gate and running before she'd made the decision to run, and she caught him as he jumped down and hugged him hard enough that he made a noise of surprised protest, and she didn't let go for a long moment. "Mama sent preserves," he said into her shoulder, "and Daddy sent, well, he just sent himself really. He's up front." She let go of Holt and looked up at the wagon. Her father was climbing down slowly from the seat, and when he straightened and looked at her, she could see the question in his face, the real question, the one underneath everything, the one he would never ask directly, because he wasn't built for direct questions when they mattered too much. "Are you all right?" She looked at him for a moment. She thought about the kitchen, the bread pips biscuits Mrs. Pruitt, and her 12 years of straightforward honesty. She thought about Clayton's hand, and the almost laugh, and, "There's a lot you don't know about me." She thought about Margaret and William, and the year you could see it, and the years you couldn't. "I'm all right," she said. Her father let out a breath that he had apparently been holding since the wedding, and walked toward her, and she went to him, and he put his arms around her the way fathers do when they are apologizing for something too large to put into words. She let him. She decided in that moment that the apology was enough. Not because what had happened was right. Because she was still here, and so was he, and the land was still there too, and she did not have the energy for a grudge that would cost them both more than they had to spend. They had coffee in the kitchen. The four of them she'd gone to get Clayton, and he'd come without question, wiping his hands on a cloth, and setting aside whatever he'd been doing, and she watched her father and Clayton talk. Carefully at first, on both sides, finding the footing of two men who are connected by something uncomfortable, and have to decide whether to stand on it or around it. It was Holt who broke it open. Holt, who was 16, and had no patience for careful, who asked Clayton direct as a fence post. "Do you know how to play cards? Because Daddy doesn't, and Eleanor is terrible, and I've been playing with myself for 2 weeks." Clayton looked at Holt for a moment. Something crossed his face that she recognized now as the almost laugh. "I know how to play cards," he said. They played 3 hands before her family left, and it was not healed. Nothing about it was healed, but something had been bent back toward upright, and that was more than she had expected from the day. After the wagon disappeared down the road, she stood in the yard for a moment, and Clayton stood a few feet away, and neither of them said anything. Then he said, "Your brother is going to be something when he's older." She thought of Holt waving both arms in the wagon bed. "He already is something," she said, "just loud about it." Clayton looked at her with that clear, assessing quality she was starting to identify as the way he actually saw things, not performance, just attention. "You love them," he said. "Yes," she said simply. "Good," he said, and walked back inside. She stayed in the yard a moment longer. Good. Not a threat in it, not a warning. Just good. As though a person loving their family was simply a right thing, a real thing, something to be valued and not managed. She was going to have to reclassify this man again. She could feel it. It was Denny who started it. She was at the general store in town, 3.5 weeks after the wedding, collecting the monthly order when she heard him behind her talking to a man she didn't know. A rancher from the next county, judging by his hat. And Denny's voice was the carrying kind, even when he was trying to keep it down. "Yeah, Hartwell bought himself a wife, what can I say? Girl's family was about to lose everything. Convenient timing." The man said something she couldn't hear. Denny laughed. "Oh, she's doing fine, don't get me wrong. Does her work keeps the house. Like a good hired hand with a ring on her finger, I guess." She finished giving her order to Sam behind the counter. She paid for it. She stacked everything into the crate with steady hands. And then she turned around. Denny saw her and went the particular color of a man who has just realized what he's done. She looked at him for a moment, at the man beside him, at the 2 or 3 other people who had gone quiet and were waiting to see what she would do. "Denny," she said pleasantly. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said with all the enthusiasm of a man expecting to be hit. "I hope the fence work on the northeast line is coming along," she said. "Mr. Hartwell mentioned it needed to be done before the week's out." A pause. "Yes, ma'am." "Good." She picked up her crate. "Don't let me keep you." She walked out of the store and loaded the wagon and drove the 7 miles back to the ranch without letting her hands shake, which took more effort than she would like to admit. Not because of what Denny had said, she had known people were saying things like that, had always known, but because of the particular quality of hearing it out loud, having it shaped into words that were carried on another person's breath and aimed in your general direction. She told Clayton that evening, not because she needed him to fix it. She was clear on that with herself. She told him because she had decided she was not going to manage information about her own life away from the person she was supposed to be partnered with, because that was exactly the kind of distance that would make this arrangement into the cold transaction everyone already believed it was. He listened without interrupting. His face when she finished was still, but she knew now that still was not the same as absent. With him still meant he was processing something with more care than it would look like from the outside. "Do you want me to say something to him?" he said. "No," she said. "I handled it." He looked at her. "I know," he said. "I'm asking because you might want me to anyway." She thought about it honestly. "No," she said again. "But thank you for offering." He nodded. Then he said, "For what it's worth, what he said wasn't true. Neither part of it." She met his eyes. "I know," she said quietly. And she did. That was the thing that surprised her most as she went to bed that night. Not that he had said it, but that she had already known it before he did. That somewhere in the past 3 weeks, the shape of this life had impressed itself on her enough that she could tell the difference between what it was and what people who didn't live it believed it to be. She was still not certain of many things. She was not certain of the future, or of how feelings grew in people who had come together like this sideways and under pressure without the normal architecture of courtship and choice. But she was certain of the bread, the cut hand, the almost laugh, the good, the 5 words in the dark. She was certain of those, and they were enough to hold on to while she figured out the rest. Outside the ranch went quiet, and the stars came out sharp over the valley, and Eleanor Hartwell lay in her room and listened to the sound of a house that was slowly, incrementally, without ceremony or announcement, beginning to feel like it had a place in it that was hers. She didn't know yet what to call that, but she felt it, and she was paying attention now. She found out about the ledger on a Tuesday, not because Clayton showed it to her. She had asked him weeks ago to be included in the ranch's finances, and he had agreed. But the actual sitting down together with the books had been postponed, the way practical things get postponed when daily work keeps filling the hours. She found it because she was looking for the household expense record to reconcile against what Mrs. Pruitt had spent at the store, and she pulled the wrong book from the shelf, and she opened it before she realized it wasn't what she was looking for. She almost closed it immediately. That was her first instinct. Shut it, put it back. It's not yours. But she had promised herself she was paying attention now, and what she saw in the first column of numbers stopped her hand. The ranch was not as stable as it looked from the outside. Not failing nothing in those columns said failing, but stretched. 3 years of thin winters and a cattle market that had gone soft in ways that didn't show up in the visible prosperity of the land and the buildings and the herd. The kind of financial pressure that a man could hold quiet for a long time if he was careful and private and ran a household where no one asked too many questions. She stood there for the long moment with the ledger open in her hands, and she thought about the particular quality of Clayton Hartwell's practicality, the way he managed everything with the same deliberate economy, nothing wasted, nothing performed, including his own worry. She thought about a man who had sat across from her father and cleared a debt he didn't need to clear at a cost that was more than it appeared. She thought he needed this to work, not just companionship, not just a household managed. He needed the stability of a functioning partnership at a time when everything else was requiring more of him than he had to give alone. She put the ledger back exactly where she found it. That evening at supper, she said, "I'd like to go over the books with you this week, when you have time." He looked up from his plate. "I pulled the wrong one by accident this morning," she said directly, because she was not going to lie to him about it. "I didn't read it thoroughly, but I saw enough to know that you're carrying more than you're letting on, and we made an agreement." The silence lasted about 4 seconds. "Saturday morning," he said. "After breakfast." "All right," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer than necessary, not with suspicion, with something she was beginning to recognize as the expression of a man recalibrating, adjusting an assumption he hadn't realized he was still holding. Then he went back to his supper, and she went back to hers, and the conversation was over. But something had shifted in the temperature of the room, and they both felt it. Saturday came and they sat at the table in the study with the account books between them, and Clayton walked her through everything: the cattle numbers, the land payments, the supplier agreements, the places where the last 2 years had been absorbed by careful management, but where another bad season would start to show. He spoke plainly, without apology, without the particular pride that makes men over-explain or understate. He laid it out the way it was. She listened, and she asked questions when she needed to, and she did not offer false reassurance or pretend the picture was better than it was, because she understood by now that was not what he needed from her. At the end of it, she said, "The kitchen garden." He looked at her. "It's not being used properly. It could be producing more than it is, and what it produces could cut the supply costs down not significantly, but consistently." She had been thinking about this for 2 weeks ever since she'd first seen the garden going half to waste. "I want to take it over completely, expand it. I know how to keep a kitchen garden, and I want to put in chickens, not a large operation, just enough for eggs and some meat through the winter. I can manage it without adding labor costs." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a real contribution," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm proposing it." Something moved in his expression. Not the almost laugh this time. Something quieter and more complete than that. He said, "Then it's yours." Just like that. No committee, no qualification. Yours. She walked out of the study, with that word sitting warm and specific in her chest, and she went directly to the neglected kitchen garden, and stood in it, with her hands on her hips, and felt for the first time since the wedding, like she was standing on ground that had a shape to it she could work with. The town social happened on the 3rd Saturday of the month. Always had, and Eleanor had known it was coming, the way you know a weather system is coming. You can see it on the horizon, and you feel it in the air before it arrives. She had not been back to town since the incident at the general store. She had not avoided it deliberately. But she also had not rushed. Clayton asked her the Thursday before if she wanted to go. Not whether they were going, whether she wanted to. She noticed the distinction. "Yes," she said. "I think we should." He nodded. "But I want to go as myself," she said, "not as a woman being managed through it." He looked at her steadily. "I wouldn't manage you," he said. "You walk in there and you're who you are. I'll be next to you, that's all." She believed him. They went. The social was held at the Grange Hall, and it was exactly what she had known it would be. 40 people who had known each other for 20 years, organized into the invisible geometries of small-town life, and 2 of those people were Eleanor and Clayton Hartwell, who had been married 6 weeks and were still being read by every set of eyes in the room. She felt it from the moment they walked in. The particular stillness that passes through a room when something people have been discussing privately suddenly becomes present. She felt it like a hand pressed flat against her sternum. She kept walking. Her mother found her first, pulling her into a hug that lasted longer than usual and smelled like the kitchen at home, and that helped. Holt appeared from somewhere with a plate of food he was working through with single-minded focus, and managed a muffled "hey" around a biscuit. Her father shook Clayton's hand, and the handshake lasted a beat longer than a formality, but shorter than a reconciliation, which Eleanor privately classified as progress. It was Margaret Pruitt who provided the first true difficulty. Not the housekeeper Margaret Pruitt, the banker's wife, the woman whose voice she had heard at the wedding, the gravitational center of Callow Creek's opinion on everything. She came at Eleanor from across the room with the focused trajectory of a woman who had decided something needed to be said and had appointed herself to say it. "Eleanor," she said warmly, the way you say something warmly when the warmth is a delivery mechanism. "You look well. You look like you've been working hard." "I have," Eleanor said. "Ranch life suits some women," Margaret Pruitt said, glancing across the room to where Clayton was talking to the pastor. "And some women it just uses up. You know what I mean." "I'm not sure I do," Eleanor said pleasantly. "What I mean is—" And here Margaret Pruitt dropped her voice to the particular register of the concerned. "You're 19, Eleanor. You should be choosing your own life, not serving in someone else's." The word serving. Eleanor looked at this woman who had whispered at the wedding and watched from the pews, and had decided that pity was both her right and her gift. And she felt something clarify inside her, like a solution settling. "I appreciate your concern," she said in a voice that was entirely steady. "But I'd ask you to be careful with assumptions about what I'm doing and why. Because what you're describing isn't my life. It just looks like it from where you're standing." Margaret Pruitt blinked. "I manage our kitchen garden and the household accounts," Eleanor continued, same even tone. "I have my own room, my own correspondence and full knowledge of the ranch finances. My family visits when they choose. I made conditions before I agreed to anything, and those conditions have been honored." She paused. "What I'd ask you to consider is whether what bothers you about my marriage is actually my welfare, or whether it's that it didn't turn out to be the sad story you were expecting." The silence in their immediate orbit was absolute. Margaret Pruitt said with considerably less warmth, "I was only trying to—" "I know," Eleanor said. "Thank you." And she moved on. Her hands were shaking slightly by the time she reached the refreshment table, and she was reaching for a glass of lemonade when she felt Clayton appear at her side. Not dramatically, he had simply materialized the way he had a talent for doing there without announcement. "I heard most of that," he said quietly. "I didn't need rescuing," she said. "I know," he said. "I wasn't coming to rescue you. I was coming because that woman has been a thorn in this county's side for 30 years, and I wanted to see how you'd handle her." A beat. "You were better at it than I would have been." She looked at him. He was looking at the room. "What would you have done?" she asked. "Said less and left faster," he said. "Your way was better." She laughed. It came out before she made the decision to let it, and it was short and genuine, and surprised even her, and she heard it in the air between them, and felt him register it beside her, and neither of them said anything about it, but it settled in the space between them, like something that belonged there. They drove home in the dark, and the silence was different from the silences before. It was not the careful silence of two people managing distance. It was the comfortable silence of two people who have been through something together and come out the other side and don't need to narrate it. About halfway home, Clayton said, "She's right about one thing." Eleanor waited. "You didn't choose this," he said, "and I've tried to make it livable, but I don't know if I've ever acknowledged that out loud. That you came here without a choice, and you've made something real out of it anyway, and that's not a small thing." She sat with that for a moment. "I made the bread work," she said finally. "You made more than the bread work," he said quietly. She didn't answer. But she didn't look away from the road ahead, and he didn't either, and the silence that followed was the warmest one yet. The thing she had been feeling coming arrived on a Wednesday 2 weeks later, and it arrived through Reuben. Reuben, the oldest of the hands, the quiet one, the one who saw everything and said almost nothing, came to the kitchen door at 7 in the morning, with his hat in his hands, and his face carrying something serious that she didn't immediately understand. "Clayton's down in the south barn," he said. "He fell. Something with his shoulder. He's up and moving, but he won't stop working, and it's worse than he's letting on." She looked at Reuben. "He told you to come, tell me," she said. Reuben was quiet for a beat. "No," he said. "He didn't. He told nobody nothing. I'm telling you because somebody should." She got the medicine box and her coat and followed Reuben to the south barn. Clayton was working through whatever had happened to his shoulder with the grim, methodical determination of a man who has decided that acknowledging an injury would require him to stop, and stopping is not presently acceptable. She could see it in the set of his jaw and the particular way he was favoring his left side and refusing to show it. "Clayton," she said. He turned, assessed the medicine box, assessed her face. "It's fine," he said. "Let me see," she said. "Eleanor." "Clayton." She held his gaze without moving. "Let me see." A long beat. He let her see. It was a separated shoulder, not fully but badly strained, the kind that needed to be immobilized and rested for at least 2 days, or it would become fully separated and take a month to recover. She told him this. He listened with his jaw still set. She waited. 2 days, he said finally. 2 days minimum, she said. Or 6 weeks. Your choice. He looked at the work around him. He looked at her. He looked at the work again. "Reuben," he said without raising his voice. Reuben, who had been standing at a reasonable distance pretending to examine a rope, said, "Yeah, boss." "You've got the south pasture today. Take Amos." "Already planned on it," Reuben said, and walked away before Clayton could change his mind. Eleanor bound his shoulder in the kitchen, and he sat still for it this time, and she worked carefully, and neither of them spoke until she was tying off the wrap. Then he said, "You told him to come get you." "Reuben made his own decision," she said. "Reuben doesn't make his own decisions about the ranch without somebody prompting him," he said. She met his eyes. "I asked him the first week," she said. "I asked all of them. I said if any one of them saw something that needed seeing to and didn't know whether to act, they could come to me." She paused. "I wasn't overstepping. I was filling a gap." He was very still. "I wasn't sure how you'd take that," he admitted. "I know," she said. "That's why I didn't tell you." The look on his face then was something she had not seen from him before. Not recalibration this time. Not the almost laugh or the careful attention. Something that was more open than those. Something that was close enough to undone that she looked away from it. Not because it made her uncomfortable exactly, but because it felt like something that deserved its own space, and she wasn't sure yet what to do with that much honesty aimed at her. She put the medicine box away. "Thank you," he said behind her. "You'd do the same," she said. "I would," he said. "But that's not why you did it." She didn't answer that, but she carried it with her for the rest of the day through the kitchen work and the garden and the long evening, turning it over, feeling its weight the way you carry something you're not ready to put down and not ready to hold close either. She cared about what happened to him, not because they were married, not because the ranch required it, not because she was still the girl at the altar trying to survive the week. She cared because the past 6 weeks had built something between them that she hadn't planned for, and it was real, and it was hers. She didn't know yet what to call it, but it was there, solid and undeniable. The way the ranch itself was solid and undeniable, the way the bread rising in the oven and the garden taking shape, and Pip saying, "Morning, Mrs. Hartwell," and Reuben coming to the kitchen door, all of it was there, growing out of difficult ground into something she hadn't expected but could no longer imagine being without. She lay awake that night for a long time, not with fear like those first nights, not with the particular exhaustion of surviving a day she hadn't chosen, but with something that had more energy in it than that, something that was asking her a question she wasn't quite ready to answer yet, but could no longer pretend she hadn't heard. Outside, the ranch was dark and quiet, and hers in a way that still surprised her when she let herself feel it fully. And somewhere down the hall, a man with a bound shoulder who didn't know how to ask for help had let her help him anyway. She thought that might be the most important thing that had happened yet. The shoulder healed in 3 days, not 2, because Clayton Hartwell was the kind of man who counted rest as a personal failing and pushed back into work the moment he could lift his arm past 90 degrees without his face going white. Eleanor said nothing about it. She had made her position clear, and he had heard it, and the decision was his to make. But she watched quietly, the way she had learned to watch everything on this ranch, with attention that didn't announce itself. What she noticed was that he worked differently now, not slower, not less, but with a kind of awareness that hadn't been visible before, a slight adjustment in the way he positioned himself near the other hands, the way he delegated one or two tasks that he would previously have absorbed without comment. As though the 2 days of enforced stillness had shown him something about what happened when he stopped, and the answer had not been collapse. The ranch had kept moving. She had kept it moving. She didn't say that either. But she filed it away in the growing catalog of things that were true between them without having been spoken. It was Reuben who said it, as he sometimes said things sideways almost to himself while doing something else entirely. She was coming out of the garden one afternoon when he passed her on his way to the water trough and said without looking directly at her, "Man used to do everything himself, like the whole operation would fall apart if he turned his back. Hadn't noticed him letting go of things before you came." He kept walking. She stood with that for a moment, then went back inside. That evening she asked Clayton over supper whether he had always run the ranch alone the way he did. He looked at the question from a few angles before answering. "It was easier to be certain than to trust," he said. "When you've had things fall apart, you get careful." "And now?" she asked. He picked up his coffee cup, set it down, said, "Now I'm learning that careful and alone aren't the same thing." She didn't respond to that immediately. She finished her supper and cleared the plates and went about the evening, and it was only later in her room that she let herself sit with what he had said long enough to feel the full weight of it. He was trusting her, not just with tasks, not just with the house and the accounts and the garden. He was trusting her with the parts of himself that had calcified over 4 years of grief and solitude and running everything through sheer stubbornness, because there had been no one else to run it with. She lay in the dark and thought, "I trust him too." The realization arrived without drama. It wasn't a revelation exactly, more like finally seeing a thing that had been standing in the room for weeks. She trusted him. She trusted the way he kept his word. She trusted the consistency of him, the fact that he was the same man at the dinner table as he was in the south barn and in the study, with the account books, and standing next to her at the town social. There was no gap in him between public and private. And for a woman who had grown up in a world full of people who performed one thing and lived another, that consistency was not a small gift. She was 20 years old in 3 weeks. She had been married for 8 weeks. And she was lying in her room in the dark, falling in love with her husband, and she had not seen it coming until it was already entirely here. She pressed her hands flat against the quilt and breathed. "All right," she thought. "All right." The letter arrived on a Friday, and it was addressed to Clayton, and she would not have known what was in it, except that he brought it to her. He set it on the table in front of her after supper, without saying anything first. She read it. It was from a man named Gerald Price, a land broker out of the county seat, and the tone of it was the particular tone of a man who believes himself to be delivering an offer so reasonable that refusal would be irrational. He was representing an unnamed buyer interested in acquiring the Hartwell Ranch and the adjacent water rights. The number offered was real money, enough to clear every strained line in those account books and leave significant remainder. He would need an answer within 30 days. She read it twice, then she looked up. "Why are you showing me this?" she said. "Because it affects you," he said. "If I sell, everything changes. Where you live, what you're building." He paused. "I wanted you to know before I decided anything." She set the letter down carefully. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "I want to know what you think," he said, and she heard the straightforwardness in it. He was not deflecting, not maneuvering, he was genuinely asking. She thought about the garden, about the chickens she'd ordered, about the household accounts she'd been trimming and rebuilding, about the bread in the kitchen, and the way this ranch ran through her hands now every single day, a living thing she had put herself into. "I think selling is a permanent answer to a temporary problem," she said. He was quiet. "The accounts are strained, but they're not broken," she continued. "We have 2 good growing seasons if we manage the herd right and the water holds. I can cut the household expenses further, not drastically, but consistently. And if we expand the garden operation and take on a small hay yield on the east field, we add income without adding significant labor." She stopped. "But it's your land, Clayton. It was your father's, and before that your grandfather's, and none of what I just said changes, that this is your decision to make." He was looking at her with that open expression she had seen in the south barn, the one that was close to undone. "When did you work all that out?" he said. "Over the last 3 weeks," she said. "I've been waiting to see if you'd bring it up or decide alone." A long silence. "I'm not selling," he said. "Good," she said. He almost laughed. She could see it the same, almost she had catalogued a dozen times, and then he did laugh quietly and briefly, and she felt it like the first warm day after a hard winter. "Right back to Price," she said. "Tell him the ranch isn't available." "Already planning on it," he said. The real trouble arrived 2 weeks after the letter. Not from Price, as it turned out, from the man behind Price. His name was Walter Cobb, and he was not a broker, he was a consolidator. And Callow Creek had been watching him swallow up smaller operations in the neighboring county for the better part of 2 years. He was systematic patient, and he did not take no as a final answer. Eleanor found out about him the way she found out about many things, through a gap in a conversation that wasn't meant for her. She was in the dry goods section of the general store when she heard the storekeeper Sam telling someone that Cobb had been at the bank that week, talking to Elias Pruitt, the banker, Margaret's husband, about acquiring water rights by alternate means if direct purchase failed. Alternate means. She bought her supplies and went home and told Clayton that evening. He sat with it for a moment, then said, "Pruitt can't act on that without cause." "He can generate cause if he wants to," she said. "If there's any irregularity in the deed records, any outstanding claim, any technicality that gives him a foothold." "There isn't," Clayton said. "Are you certain?" He wasn't certain. She could see it. He was confident, but certainty and confidence were different things, and he was honest enough to know it. "Who filed the original deed?" she asked. "My father, 1871. "Then we need someone to look at it," she said, "before Cobb does." Clayton looked at her across the table, and she held the look, and she watched him decide. "I'll ride to the county seat Monday," he said. "I'm coming with you," she said. The faintest pause. "All right," he said. The county seat was a half-day's ride, and they left before sunrise, and she sat beside him on the wagon and watched the country open up around them and felt the particular quality of a shared purpose, the way it compresses distance, makes silence comfortable, gives two people a direction that belongs to both of them equally. At the Land Records Office, they found the deed. It was intact, clean, properly witnessed, exactly as it should be. But it was the clerk, a small, careful man named Aldous, who had worked that office for 20 years and clearly enjoyed knowing things, who told them, while ostensibly studying a form on his desk, that a man matching Cobb's description had been in 2 weeks prior asking to review adjacent property surveys. "What was he looking for?" Clayton asked. Aldous looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Access roads," he said. "Old survey access roads that might cross registered private land." He looked back at his form. If a road was ever registered for shared use, and the current owner didn't maintain the exclusion claim, it could create a right-of-way argument. Clayton went very still. Eleanor said, "Does the Hartwell deed have a shared road registration?" Aldous turned several pages, found one, set it on the counter without comment, and stepped away to file something else. There it was. A survey road running along the north edge of the property, registered in 1868, 3 years before Clayton's father bought the land with a notation of agricultural access. Never formally converted to private exclusion. Never challenged because no one had ever tried to use it. Until now. She looked at Clayton. He was reading the same line. "He can claim right-of-way," she said quietly. "He can use it to run cattle or equipment across the north edge and make the water access argument from there." "Can we close it?" Clayton asked Aldous' direction. Aldous reappeared at the counter as if summoned. File an exclusion claim, have it witnessed, recorded, and posted within 60 days. Uncontested, it's clean. He paused. Contested, that's a different matter. Will it be contested? Eleanor asked. Aldous looked at her for the first time fully. If the party interested has resources and patience, he said carefully, it could take a while. She thought about Cobb. Systematic. Patient. File the exclusion today, she said to Clayton. He looked at her. She held it. Today, she said again. We'll file today, Clayton told Aldous. They sat in that office for 3 hours filling out paperwork, and Eleanor checked every line, asked 3 questions. Aldous answered with visible approval and signed as a named party to the Hartwell property claim, because Clayton told the clerk to add her name without hesitation and without her asking. She looked at her name on that document. Eleanor Hartwell, named party. Eleanor Hartwell, co-registrant. Something moved through her that she couldn't fully name. Not triumph bigger than that. Something that felt like the first time she had stood in the kitchen garden and thought, this is mine. Except larger, more permanent, more fully true. On the ride home, when the county seat was well behind them and the road ahead was open and quiet, Clayton said, I wouldn't have caught that. You might have, she said. Not in time, he said. She let that sit for a moment. I had been thinking about how Cobb would move, she said. Not specifically about the road, but about where a man like that looks for leverage when a direct offer fails. He looks for what the owner doesn't know about their own land. She paused. That's why I said we needed to look at the deed. How did you know to think that way? He asked. She considered the question honestly. My father lost his footing because he didn't know exactly what he had until someone else was already standing on it, she said. I decided I wasn't going to live that way. He was quiet for a long stretch of road. Then he said, There's something I want to do. When we get home. I've been thinking about it for a while, and today settled it for me. She waited. I want to transfer 200 acres to your name, he said. The south field and the water easement on the lower creek. Independent of the marriage in your name, your deed, your asset. The wagon kept moving. The horses kept pulling. Eleanor said nothing for a full 30 seconds because she needed those seconds to keep herself from saying something she hadn't thought through. Why? She said finally. Because you've earned land, he said. Because you came here with nothing and you've put yourself into this ranch and this life in a way that deserves something solid under it. Because if anything happens to me, you should have ground that belongs to you and can't be touched. He was looking at the road ahead, voice level and plain. And because I should have done it sooner. She looked at his profile. She thought about the girl at the altar with the borrowed dress and the wilted flowers, telling herself she was going to walk like a woman making a choice. She thought about 19 and a debt and a handshake that had rearranged her life without asking. She thought about bread and ledgers and a bound shoulder and a name on a deed at a county records office. I want to do it publicly, she said. He turned to look at her. In town, she said. In front of people. Not because I need the audience, but because what you're saying deserves to be witnessed. Because there are people in that town who have been telling a story about us since the beginning, and what you're proposing is the true version of this, and I think the true version should have witnesses. He held her gaze for a long moment. When? He said. Saturday market, she said. When the whole town is there. He turned back to the road. Saturday, he said, and that was that. She sat beside him the rest of the way home and felt the ranch coming closer with every turn of the wheel, and she thought about Saturday and witnesses and her name on a deed, and she thought about the question she had been carrying for weeks, the one she hadn't been ready to answer. She thought she might be ready now, not because of the land. The land was not the reason. The land was the proof of something that had already been true, and what was true was this. She had come to this ranch as a transaction, and she was leaving that story behind. And the man sitting beside her on this wagon had made that possible. Not by being everything she had dreamed of, she was too practical for dreams, but by being exactly consistently, entirely himself. And herself had turned out to be exactly what she needed. She didn't say any of this, not yet. There was Saturday to get through first, and she wanted to do things in the right order. But she held it warm and certain all the way home. Saturday came in cold and clear the way mornings do when the season is turning, and the air hasn't decided yet whether to stay or go. Eleanor was up before the household. She dressed without rushing, chose her own clothes, not the borrowed dress, not anything that had belonged to someone else. And she stood in her room for a moment before going downstairs, and she looked at the woman in the small mirror, and she did not look away. She looked like herself. That was the thing she noticed most. Not the girl who had gripped wilted flowers at the altar. Not the 19-year-old who had walked into a stranger's house calculating how to survive it. The woman in the mirror had a particular quality of settledness, a groundedness that had not been there before, and Eleanor recognized it the way you recognize something you grew yourself, because you put the work in, and you watched it take shape, and now here it was, standing in the glass, looking back at her with steady eyes. She went downstairs. Clayton was already at the table with his coffee, and he looked up when she came in, and she saw him take in the fact of her not as an assessment, not as an appraisal, but the way a person looks at something they are glad to see in the morning. And he said, "You ready?" "Yes," she said. Mrs. Pruitt put a plate in front of her without being asked, and refilled Clayton's coffee without comment, and Eleanor ate her breakfast, and felt the day gathering itself around her, steady and purposeful and entirely real. The Saturday market in Callow Creek was the town's weekly heartbeat. Every shop open, every farmer with something to sell, every family with somewhere to be. It was the place where news traveled fastest, and where things witnessed became things known, and that was exactly why she had chosen it. They arrived mid-morning when the market was at full volume. She felt the shift when people saw them coming. Not a dramatic hush, more like a collective redirect of attention, the way a room full of people who have been talking about you recalibrates when you walk in. She had been at enough of these markets before her wedding to know the geometries of this town by heart, and she knew which faces would tighten and which would open, and which would do the particular performance of studied neutrality that meant they were watching hardest of all. She walked beside Clayton through the center of it, and she did not shrink. Her father was there with Holt near the seed merchant's table, and Holt saw her first and raised a hand, and her father turned and nodded, and she felt the thread between them still tender, in places still not everything it had been, but real and intact and continuing to mend. Clayton exchanged greetings with the men he knew, and she spoke to the women she knew, and they moved through the market the way a couple that has learned each other's rhythms moves without consulting, without performing, just existing in the same space with a familiarity that did not need to announce itself. It was Margaret Pruitt who provided the first collision of the morning. She came at them from the dry goods side, her husband Elias half a step behind her, a thin, careful man whose face had the look of someone who had long since learned to follow the weather rather than predict it. Margaret's eyes went to Eleanor first, then to Clayton, then back to Eleanor with a brightness that was entirely too interested to be casual. "Clayton," she said warmly. "And Eleanor, what a morning to be out." "Margaret," Clayton said. "I was just saying to Elias—" Margaret began, and then something made her stop. Not Clayton's expression, which was civil and unchanged. Something in Eleanor's. "Is something happening today?" "Yes?" Eleanor said pleasantly. "There is." Margaret looked between them. "What sort of something?" "The public sort," Eleanor said, and moved on. She heard Margaret say something to Elias behind her, and she did not turn around. Clayton had arranged it quietly and efficiently in the way he arranged everything a word to the pastor, who had a natural talent for gathering people around something, and a word to Sam at the general store, whose front steps were elevated enough to be seen from most of the market. By the time they made their way there, about 30 people had already drifted into the general orbit without being entirely sure why. Eleanor stood beside Clayton on the steps, and she looked out at the faces of Callow Creek, her town, the town she had grown up in, the town that had whispered about her and watched her, and constructed a story about her life that was almost entirely wrong, and she felt no anger. Not anymore. What she felt was something clearer and less complicated than anger. She felt ready. Clayton spoke first. He did not raise his voice. He never needed to. There was something in the particular register of how he spoke that made people go quiet to hear it, and they went quiet now. "Most of you were at my wedding 10 weeks ago," he said. "And I know what most of you thought about it. I know what's been said." He paused, not defensively, just allowing the fact of it to sit in the air where everyone could acknowledge it. "I'm not here to argue with any of that. I'm here because there's a truth about that marriage that this town doesn't have, and my wife has earned the right to have it said publicly." 30 people were absolutely still. "I came to Thomas Wade with a proposition because I needed a partner, and he needed help," Clayton continued. "That's the accurate version of what happened. I paid a debt that was going to take his land, and I want to be plain about this, not to buy his daughter, to give her a choice. Because what I proposed to Eleanor before she agreed was exactly that, a choice. Conditions. Her own room. Her own correspondence. Full knowledge of this ranch's finances. And a promise that if this life became something she couldn't live in, she would not be left worse than she came to me." He looked at the crowd. "She made conditions. I agreed to them. She came to the ranch on her own terms, and in the 10 weeks since she has run. The household managed the accounts, expanded the kitchen garden, caught a legal threat to our land that I would not have found in time, and ridden with me to the county seat to protect what my grandfather built." Another pause. "She has been a partner in every sense of the word, and today I am transferring 200 acres of Hartwell land, the South Field, and the Lower Creek easement into her name alone. Her deed. Her asset. Hers entirely independent of this marriage and belonging to no one else." So, the silence in the market was the kind that has weight. Eleanor looked at the faces and saw them moving, saw the recalibration happening in real time, saw the story people had been holding, getting disrupted, saw Margaret Pruitt's expression go through 3 distinct phases before settling into something complicated and still. She saw her father's face. Thomas Wade was standing near the edge of the gathered crowd, and he was looking at Clayton with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not relief exactly, something more than that. Something that looked like a man being shown that the decision that had kept him awake for 10 weeks had landed somewhere he hadn't dared to hope for. His eyes moved to her. She held his gaze, and she gave him a small nod. Not forgiveness. Forgiveness had already happened quietly without ceremony somewhere in the middle of a kitchen table card game. Just acknowledgement. We're all right. He looked down. She saw his chest rise and fall. Clayton said, "I didn't buy a wife. I made a proposal to a woman with good sense and more capability than anyone in this town knew, and she had the courage to say yes under hard circumstances, and she has not stopped building something worth having from the first day to this one." He looked at Eleanor, then directly in front of everyone. "The land transfer documents are at the county records office, filed and witnessed as of yesterday morning. Her name is on the deed. That's all I had to say." He stepped back, and the whole market turned to look at Eleanor. She had thought about what she would say. She had not prepared a speech she did not want. A speech did not want anything that felt rehearsed. But she had turned the essential thing over in her mind on the wagon ride and in the quiet of the previous evening, and she knew what was true, and she was going to say it. She looked at the crowd. "I came to this marriage afraid," she said. "I won't pretend otherwise because most of you saw it on my face, and there's no point in rewriting that." Her voice was even and clear. "I came in a dress that didn't fit, carrying flowers I hadn't picked, walking toward a man I didn't know. And every single person in that church that day had already decided what my life was going to look like." She paused. "You were wrong." A few people shifted. No one spoke. "Not because it's been easy," she continued, But because what I found on that ranch was not what you assumed I'd find. I found a man who kept every word he gave me. I found work that was real and mine. I found a household that needed someone willing to see it clearly, and I was willing. She looked at her father briefly, then back at the crowd. I stay on that ranch because I choose to. Not because I was bought, not because I have nowhere else to go, not because I don't know my own mind. Because I looked at the life in front of me, and I decided it was worth building. She straightened slightly. I want you to have that truth. Not because I owe it to you, I don't. But because there are young women in this town who may one day be standing where I was standing 10 weeks ago. And I want them to know that the story other people tell about your life is not the only story available. You get to write the one that's true. The market was absolutely silent. And then her brother Holt, 16 years old and entirely without self-consciousness, said from somewhere in the crowd, "That's right," in the casual tone of someone confirming an obvious fact, and the tension broke and a few people laughed, and then several more, and the particular frozen quality of the moment dissolved into something warmer and more human. Clayton was beside her then. She hadn't heard him move. He had just arrived the way he arrived at things without announcement. He stood next to her, and their arms were touching, and neither of them moved away. Elias Pruitt, of all people, started to applaud. It was tentative at first, the clapping of a man doing something his wife had not approved in advance. And then a few others joined, and then more. And by the end, it was most of the market. And it was not polite applause. It was the kind that comes from people who have been given permission to feel something they were already feeling. Margaret Pruitt was not applauding. But she was not looking cruel either. She was looking at Eleanor with an expression that was harder to read than anything she'd worn before. Something that might, if given time, become genuine respect. It wasn't there yet. But the door to it was open in a way it hadn't been. That was enough. Her father found her afterward, when the crowd had dispersed back into the business of the market, and Clayton had been pulled into a conversation with the pastor, and Holt had discovered a dog near the butcher's table that he was now apparently responsible for. Thomas Wade stood in front of his daughter and looked at her for a long moment. "I owe you more than I can say," he said. "You owe me a conversation," she said. "When you're ready, not today." He nodded. "Is she good? Eleanor? Is it actually good?" She thought about everything she could have said. The bread and the ledger, and the bound shoulder, the ride to the county seat, her name on the deed, Clayton's voice saying, "I'm not selling, and she has earned land and yours entirely." "It's good, Daddy," she said. "It's genuinely good." He pressed his lips together and looked away for a moment, and she saw his eyes go bright, and she put her hand briefly on his arm, and then let him have the moment without watching it too closely, because some things a person needs to feel without an audience. When he looked back at her, he was composed. "Clayton Hartwell," he said with the tone of a man updating a previous assessment, "is a better man than I gave him credit for." "Most people are," she said, "when you give them the right conditions." Her father looked at her like he was seeing her new. Like the girl he had sent into the unknown had come back as something he hadn't entirely anticipated, and was proud of in a way he didn't yet have the language for. "Your grandmother would have liked you," he said finally. It was the highest thing he knew how to say. She knew that about him. "I know," she said. "Go find Holt before he brings that dog home." He went, and she stood for a moment alone in the middle of the market in her own clothes on her own 2 feet, with her name on a deed in a county records office, and the full clear knowledge of exactly where she stood and what she was building and who she was building it with. The drive home was quiet and warm, and the afternoon light was doing what afternoon light does in that country in the turning season, coming in long and gold and serious like it means to stay a while. About a mile from the ranch, she said, "I have something to tell you." Clayton glanced at her. "I've known it for a few weeks," she said. "I wanted to wait until it was certain before I said it out loud." She felt him go still beside her, not tense, but focused the way he focused on things that mattered. "I'm with child," she said. The words were simple and clean in the air between them. Clayton did not speak immediately, and she did not fill the silence, because she had learned to trust his silences, had learned that they were not absence but presence, not withholding but processing, and whatever was moving through him in that moment was real and worth the time it needed. When he stopped the wagon, she understood. He stopped it on the road a mile from the ranch with no particular reason except that he needed to be still. He sat with his hands on the reins, and he looked straight ahead, and she could see him breathing. Then he said, Are you well?" "I'm very well," she said. He turned to look at her then, and his face was open in a way she had only seen glimpses of before, all the careful management of expression set aside, just the man underneath it, raw and real, and trying to contain something too large to contain quietly. "I didn't think—" He started and stopped. She knew what he hadn't thought. 4 years. Margaret, William. The particular weight of hoping for something after you have lost it at the worst possible cost. "I know," she said quietly. His jaw moved. He looked at his hands on the reins, then back at her. "I'm going to be—" He stopped again. "You're going to be with me through it," she said firmly. "Both of us. Every part of it." She held his eyes. "I'm not afraid, Clayton. And I need you to not be afraid either. Not for my sake. You're allowed to feel everything you're feeling about this. But I need you here with me, not back there with the fear." Something settled in him. She watched it happen. "Here," he said. "I'm here." "Good," she said. He reached over and took her hand, and she let him hold it, and they sat there on the road for another minute, while the horses waited, and the afternoon light came down golden and patient around them, and then he picked up the reins, and they drove the last mile home. Spring arrived. The way spring always arrives on that land, not gently, but insistently pushing through whatever the winter had left behind, with the particular stubbornness of living things that have decided they are going to grow regardless. Eleanor planted the expanded garden herself, the same way she had planned it all winter, more organized. Now better laid out with the rows she had measured on paper, becoming real rows in real ground. And she worked them in the mornings while Clayton managed the cattle and the hands worked the outer fields, and the ranch breathed around her the way it had been breathing since she arrived, steady and ongoing and entirely alive. She was 3 months along, and she felt well, and she told Mrs. Pruitt, who said, "About time there was something to plan for," and immediately began reorganizing the household schedule with the focused energy of a woman who has been waiting for a project of appropriate scale. Pip had grown 4 inches over the winter, and was no longer the youngest hand in the yard, because they'd taken on a boy of 15 named George, who reminded Eleanor of Pip at his most uncertain, and she started leaving 2 plates of biscuits out in the mornings, and said nothing about it. Reuben, when she told him about the baby, looked at her for a moment and said, "He'll be good at it." Then he went to tend the horses, and that was that. Holt came on a Sunday, and was so visibly thrilled at the prospect of being an uncle that he fell off the fence he was sitting on, demonstrating something, and Clayton, who had seen it coming, caught him by the collar before he hit the ground, and Eleanor laughed so hard she had to sit down. Her father came too. He came more often now. He and Clayton had found a language between them that was not the language of debt and apology, but the language of men who respect the same woman and are learning to respect each other through her. And they talked cattle and weather and fence lines with the ease of people who have decided to move forward instead of standing in place. The conversation she had told him she needed the real one. The harder one happened on a Tuesday afternoon in the kitchen when it was just the 2 of them. And it was not as difficult as she had feared, because her father did not defend himself, and she did not accuse him. And what they built in that hour was not the restoration of something old, but the beginning of something new, which was better anyway. "I'm proud of you," he said at the end of it. "I was always proud of you. I need you to know I never stopped being." "I know, Daddy," she said. "I always knew." On the last day of planting season, when every row was in the ground, and the kitchen garden had become the established productive thing she had planned it into, Eleanor walked out to the south field, her 200 acres. The deed with her name on it, the water easement, running clear along the lower creek, and she stood at the edge of it, and she looked at it. She was 20 years old. She had been married for 4 months. She was carrying her first child. She had her name on land that would outlast her and her husband, and the opinions of every person in Callow Creek who had told a story about her life from the outside. Clayton came to stand beside her. She had heard him coming across the field, his boots on the dry grass, unhurried. "What are you thinking?" he said. "That I'm going to need more fence posts on the east side before the summer," she said. He looked at her sideways. She smiled. "And that I'm glad," she said. "That I'm genuinely, completely glad." He looked out at the field. "So am I," he said. In that plain, direct, entirely honest voice that had been the same on the wagon and in the study and at the market and on the road when he stopped and took her hand. The same voice she had been learning since the beginning. The voice she had come to trust more than any performance of feeling, because it never performed anything. She took his arm. They stood together at the edge of what was theirs. Not possession, not transaction, not the arrangement that Callow Creek had decided it was, but a life that two people had built out of difficult ground with hard work and kept promises and the particular grace of choosing each other every day in all the ordinary and extraordinary ways that choosing never stops. The field lay before them green and beginning, and the creek ran clear at the far edge, and somewhere behind them, the ranch went on with its breathing, and the rows in the garden held their seeds in the dark earth. And Eleanor Hartwell stood on her own land, with her husband's arm under her hand, and her child growing quiet and certain inside her, and she knew with the full, grounded, unshakable certainty of a woman who has learned exactly what she is made of, that she was exactly where she had chosen to be. Not because someone had arranged it, not because she had no other choice, but because she had looked at this life and recognized it as hers, and she had claimed it, and she had built it, and it was good. And that every difficult, unexpected, entirely real piece of it was the truest thing she had ever owned.